Hello and welcome to TV 247. I'm Brian Mier. To the left of me is Anand Naidu from CGTN, from the program The Heat. And to my right, your left, is Shoban Saxena, the Brazil correspondent from The Hindu. Now, we're here today because the BRICS summit is coming up in Brasilia. There have been a lot of changes in Brazil recently, and we want to talk about how BRICS media institutions can work together to build a kind of BRICS narrative. So with that, I would like to pass the mic to Anand. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me here. It's an important issue that you raised there, changing the media narrative for BRICS countries. Well, I think generally for developing countries or the global south in general. It's been a challenge for many countries in the south, and I would sort of take the period from post-World War II to control, because the international media flow has been controlled largely by Western countries, the United States, Europe, etc. And there's been an attempt to change that. Unfortunately, the attempts have come very late. I think the first big major attempt to change that was the creation of Al Jazeera, which actually had as its brief to give a voice to the voiceless and to talk truth to power. I was fortunate to work for them at one point. And one of the things that Al Jazeera did, and did very well, successfully, was that it identified those parts of the world that were not being covered, mainly developing countries, or being covered in a way that was very distorted. It's what some called parachute journalism, where people fly into these countries when there's a major disaster, cover it. They fly out of London or New York or Berlin or Paris or wherever, cover these countries, and then pack up their equipment and leave and wait for the next disaster. It's not covering countries on a continuous basis. Al Jazeera at that point, and some other news organizations as well, including CGTN, which was a pretty recent addition to the media scene, identified that and said that we've got to change that. And one of the things we can do to change that is to have reporters in the developing world, based there permanently, reporting the story on a day-to-day basis.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Morning, Brian. Morning, Anand.
Good morning.
Thank you 247 and thank you CGTN for inviting me as a representative of an Indian newspaper to talk about this very important issue of BRICS. On October 30 and 31st, we had a BRICS Media Forum here in Sao Paulo. I had more than 100 journalists from 5 BRICS countries talking about these issues. A very interesting picture came out of that meeting, actually, and that is the BRICS countries need to tell their own story, because the coverage that we get in the Western media is not fair, whether it's The Guardian or New York Times or Wall Street Journal. It's a very distorted picture they present about these countries. These countries as members of BRICS and as individual countries. So I think the BRICS countries need to tell their stories. They need to share their stories with each other, and they also need to build a joint narrative. Because if you look at the original mandate of the BRICS, was to prepare the world for some kind of a post-Western scenario. Everybody's talking about it. The center of gravity of the world economy is shifting towards Asia, towards India and China, and most towards Eastern world. And so in that scenario, if countries like India and China and Russia, Brazil, South Africa have to provide some kind of leadership, especially to the developing world, we need to have our own narrative. If you look at Financial Times, the only stories about BRICS countries are negative stories. It's like BRICS is going to collapse any time, or there are differences between BRICS countries. They play on differences. Of course there are differences. India and China have differences. Brazil and South Africa may have differences. But I think what these countries share with each other, the commonality of problems and commonality of solutions is much bigger than the problems they have with each other. I think in that regard it's very important to build a common narrative, build common platforms, pool in resources, and create a BRICS narrative to challenge the Western narrative and also to prepare the world for the future. I think in that regard we're having a very important discussion here today.
Regarding narratives, really if you look at the way that the northern media has been portraying Brazil, Lula was just released from his political imprisonment on Friday, and the narrative that was built in the north never questioned all of the problems with the case against Lula. In fact, now that The Intercept has revealed these leaked social media conversations, between the judge and the prosecutors. We know that they were colluding illegally the entire time. They admitted they had no evidence against Lula. The United States Department of Justice was involved the entire time. We now see that Hank Johnson, the congressman from Georgia, and 13 other congressmen have requested clarification from the U.S. Department of Justice on the DOJ's role in Lula's arrest. None of this is ever questioned in the media. None of it was ever appeared in the northern media. They never, even on the day that Lula was released, The Guardian ran a newspaper story in which they didn't mention that The Intercept social media conversations prove that Lula was not guilty of any crime. They're still acting as if he was guilty of something. And I think you see that, and you look at the narrative of China as well in the northern media. I mean, who is the United States and who are American journalists to question anything about human rights in China? But we have this huge consensus that's been manufactured in the North that China is the biggest human rights abuser in the world, when the U.S. is at war with 7 countries right now, when it's locking up children on the border. It seems like there's a real need to build some kind of counter-hegemony to these master narratives that are coming basically from the United States and its allies.
I think one of the first things we have to recognize when you talk about the media in countries like the United States, or for that matter, to a large extent, in the United Kingdom as well, is that the media there reflect the establishment. They're not the old school media which acted as that fourth estate, like the final check and balance on the 3 other branches of government. Now they're part of it, and part of that changed pretty recently because of the corporate takeover of major media organizations. I mean, it has been like that for a very long time, but now it's open and it's out there. And so the media reflect the establishment. They are not going to upset that apple cart at all. To a large extent, they depend for their existence on cooperating with the establishment. So we have to recognize that first. There are a few organizations in the U.S., the Intercept you mentioned, for one. There's the Young Turks, Cenk Uyghur's organization as well. There's organizations like yours, Brazil 247, that is challenging that, trying to change the balance of power. But one of the things that actually runs in favor of organizations like this is that young people now don't trust the mainstream media any longer. They put more trust in online media. So that's a golden opportunity. It's almost low-hanging fruit for media organizations like this. I think that's one of the ways, and one has to develop it. I know, for instance, my organization, CGTN, is putting a lot of money, a lot of investment, a lot of manpower into developing its digital platform, because that's where it sees the future. It recognizes that the future is here. It's not so much on the cable systems that we see all the time.
I absolutely agree with what Alan just said. It's an irony that the organizations like The Guardian, New York Times, the MSNBC, the so-called liberal media establishments, whom you expect to do a fair reporting, I think they very much push the neoliberal agenda of the government. And it shows in the reporting when something happens in Hong Kong. I mean, Guardian gives it wall-to-wall coverage for days and hours. And when there's millions of people out on the streets in Chile being shot by the army and people getting blinded, and the story is absolutely ignored. So I think this is very unfair coverage. Yeah. They decide what suits I think they're very much in line with the U.S. State Department or the intelligence agencies. They're told by, to build that kind of narrative. I think the solution to this is that the BRICS countries need to put in more resources in each other. For example, I think it's a shame that, no Brazilian newspaper or channel has a correspondent in India. I mean, India is a fairly important player in global affairs these days. It's an emerging country. It's a fairly emerging country. It's a growing economy. A lot of things are happening there, and there's no Brazilian journalists in India. I think they have very little presence in China. I don't know if they have anyone in Russia. I'm the only Indian journalist in Brazil. In fact, in the whole of South America. That's again is a shame. I think we can't leave it to private media players because they don't have interest in promoting a BRICS narrative or even creating some kind of cooperation with these countries. Two examples come to our mind. The first is the RT, the Russia Today channel. I think they have done a great job in building a counter narrative to the Western hegemony. They really have put in the resources. RT, Sputnik, and I think CGTN is doing the same. I think it's up to the government of these countries to put in more resources for a fair media coverage and to create more media cooperation between the countries. We can't leave it to media players, private players. It's beyond them.
And I was wondering, Shriman, when you talk about representation in other countries, CGTN, for instance, has a pretty active office in Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm not sure about the other BRICS countries. But how big a challenge is that, do you think, for the BRICS countries to represent each other in these big centers?
I don't think it should be a problem because these countries are open to opening offices, opening to cooperation, and this is the discussion we had at the BRICS Media Forum. I think not only opening offices and centers, but also creating common platforms, digital platform, sharing the resources, sharing the views, sharing opinions. We can create some kind of a BRICS-wide service. That should be very interesting. I mean, CGT has huge resources. I think they can tie up with some Indian media organization, Brazilian media organization. They can all come on a common platform, create a BRICS-wide service, and address the issues which are important to BRICS countries. One of the most important things in the past 30, 40 years that has happened in the world is the number of people lifted out of poverty in China, India, and Brazil and South Africa. This is the story of the past 30 years. Huge, millions of people. I think more than 60, 70 million people in China, maybe 100 million people in China. And Brazil had 52 million people lifted out of poverty. You don't see that story in the Western media. And if it's reported in a negative way. Like this is some kind of throwing away of precious resources being spent. Even the local media here, the private players, they have very skeptical and negative view of anything. I think this is a story the BRICS continue to tell, how you lift people out of poverty. This story is very important for Africa. This story is very important for Central American countries, for other South American countries. Well, I think when I talk about building a BRICS narrative, is about telling these kind of stories and pooling our resources and create a new narrative.
Yeah, I think what you just said is really important because, as you say, the way that the media has reported, for example, 40 million people rising above the poverty line in Brazil during the PT years, is that Lula was the beneficiary of this Chinese commodity boom, and that people were just naturally lifted out of poverty because the economy was booming. Well, if that were the case, there wouldn't be any poverty in Brazil, because since it was founded 500 years ago, it's gone through dozens of commodities boom cycles, none of which ever reduced poverty in any significant way until the beginning of the 21st century. Okay, but then the other factor is that there was the 2008 world financial crisis during Lula's presidency, which he kept, the government stayed out of that crisis almost entirely. They had 1 quarter of negative growth or something through Keynesian counter measures, stimulus for internal industrial production and consumption and things like that. That is just missing from the Anglo narrative about how Brazil reduced poverty. They make it look like it's an accident now. So I think that's a very good example.
Yeah, just to add one more point, India launched the world's biggest anti-poverty program called the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in some 10 years ago, and it was inspired by Bolsa Familia. Now, if you ask people in India or in Brazil how many people know that, they wouldn't be aware about that because it hasn't been reported that way. So I think instead of letting this Western media organization tell our story, the BRICS stories, we need to tell our own story and about this cooperation that these countries have.
Yeah, it depends on what we cover as well. For instance, on The Heat, the show that I host in Washington, we tend to look outside of what the mainstream media is running on a day-to-day basis. You find that in the United States, for instance, that a lot of the secondary media, if I could put it that way, take the lead from what the big newspapers and the big television stations are doing. And those, in turn, take the lead from what the State Department is saying every morning at their briefings and what the White House is saying, rather than challenging what they're saying. So on The Heat, for instance, we try to cover stories that deal with things like poverty, political issues, mainly in developing countries, as well as issues that we've done a lot of stories on things that happen in the United States. Gun violence, which is very badly covered. I mean, when was the last time you saw a story in a major U.S. newspaper on the demonstrations that have been taking place in Paris for the last, I think, 6 months, the Gilets jaunes demonstrations? Yeah. I don't think we have. So we cover those kinds of things. One of the problems we have is with distribution, and that is a lot of the big, and I'm talking here about cable TV, a lot of the big distribution companies around the world tend to relegate us to second or third tiers, so the big guys buy the space at the top. That has to change, and that can only be changed at a national level. I mean, I really sometimes question why, there's certain big American networks that are given such prominence in a country like South Africa, when you're not afforded the same thing in the United States. You can't get your voice heard in the United States in the same way, so why are you doing it for these big networks?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I see that CNN, for example, is opening up in Brazil now, and the head newscaster, anchor they've hired, is someone who was fired from Globo for being racist. He was caught on camera making racist comments about Afro-Brazilians, and he was revealed in WikiLeaks to be a CIA informant as of 2005. And that's the person CNN's bringing in. And there's all of this oba-oba about CNN arriving in Brazil now. If you look at the narrative that's built up around the coup that took place yesterday in Bolivia, for example, we saw the buildup in the Anglo media. And it's not just the media companies, it's not just the government, but it's like the integral state feeding these narratives back and forth between each other, because we didn't just have the Organization of American States, which is 66% of its funding comes from the US government. It announced that the elections in Bolivia were illegitimate, even though Evo Morales won by over 10%, which hasn't happened in a US presidential election since 1972. It won by a very wide margin. But also, the United States Latin American Studies Association issued this manifesto rejecting the elections without any, evidence whatsoever. And so these kinds of things then fed into the media, into the Anglo media, everyone working together to build this climate up for the American public, and in turn the satellite countries of the U.S. empire that build their narratives based on what's happening in the U.S. media, like global television here in Brazil, to just normalize this false idea that there was some problem with the election in Bolivia, so that there could be another military coup, removing the first indigenous leader in Latin America since the 1500s from power, and we see this happening over and over. That's why it's so important that I think that media organizations in the BRICS nations begin to work together to counter these hegemonic narratives. And one of the problems I've noticed in Brazil is just the language barrier. Everyone wants to do it. Everyone's been talking about this for years. But when it comes to actually like budgeting someone to dub or to translate or something like that, it doesn't seem like anyone has the motivation or the finances to move forwards with it. So I feel like this conversation about improved South-South or BRICS cooperation among media, among counter-hegemonic voices in the media, has been stalled for years because of language issues too,
Yeah, funding is a problem, and it's very difficult to monetize a lot of media organizations, especially in the developing world. There just isn't that kind of funding available on a commercial basis or anything like that. But it's also it wouldn't be advisable to get funding from the government, for instance, for these things, because that already makes you beholden to them.
Yeah, I think funding is a problem, but I think Brazilian media also has a problem of mindset. I think the mindset here is very much colonized. You read stories about India. They're taken from New York Times, they're taken from Financial Times. So it's the Financial Times saying something about India and it's reproduced as it is by the Brazilian media. And even when they spend some money, they go to India, they do very stereotypical stories on the Ganges, on the cows, on the tuk-tuks. I mean, these stories have been done and dusted, so many times. I mean, India has so many fascinating stories. I think India is not only just economic story, India has social innovation happening, social changes happening. Also, India has a huge amount of problems, which can be similar to Brazil. but India has some very positive side also. India has poverty, but don't have problems with drugs and guns. And if you can in India, you can walk into a slum and come out and nothing will happen to you. So I think in that sense, I think India and Brazil have a lot to learn from each other as emerging countries. But they go to India and end up doing this exotic India story, the Taj Mahal and Rajasthan and palaces, and nothing tells the story. So I think the Brazilians look at India as Europeans, as North Americans, and not as a fellow emerging countries, members of emerging countries. I think this is a big problem here, especially the mainstream corporate media here, I think has a very, very colonized mindset. They're not ready to challenge the Western hegemonic narrative, and not ready to build their own narrative also, and I don't think they see themselves as an emerging country.
Yeah,
That's
in
a
many
big problem.
instances, the Western media also have this holier-than-thou attitude and a very hypocritical attitude. For instance, the New York Times ran a series not so long ago on corruption in South Africa, which is fine. It's great. Let's acknowledge that is a huge problem in South Africa. But I have never seen the New York Times run a series on corruption in the United States, in a place which the entire political system is built on corruption. They just relabel it campaign finance and say lobbying, whatever the case may be. We know that in Washington it's just thousands of lawyers there just on the take. So are politicians, but you never see that. It's this very, it's right, it's a colonial mentality in the way they look at it.
The anti-corruption narrative has been weaponized and used specifically in these kind of lawfare attacks to take out any leader who challenges neoliberalism right now, really. I mean, that's what's going on with corruption. And I agree 100%. I've been living in Brazil 25 years, but I'm from Chicago. I tell Brazilian people, because Brazilian people often come to me and say, oh, how can you stand living in Brazil? It's so corrupt. I tell Brazilian people that the city I grew up in has no term limit for mayor. It has no public bidding process. The mayor can give public construction contracts to anyone he wants.
Yeah.
And, that one mayor was in office for 26 years, and then his son was mayor for 25 years, and people's minds are blown. The American system is obviously the most corrupt system in the world, and the most corrupt thing I've ever seen in my lifetime has been the Iraq War. Billions of dollars disappeared. No one even knows where it comes from. And the vice president of the United States was the former director of a company that was a prime beneficiary of the war contract.
And still is a beneficiary.
And still is Halliburton, right? So once again, just as who are the United States? Who are bourgeois American journalists to start criticizing other countries about corruption or human rights issues, really? Because we're looking at the most corrupt nation in the world and the biggest human rights abuser in the world right now.
Yeah, we see that a lot. I see it sitting in Washington every day. Those stories that go out, and you find politicians making these lofty pronouncements on human rights or corruption or good governance about the developing world, and all they have to do is look in the mirror.
I think what gives the Western media the power is their presence, actually. If you look at Reuters, AP, Bloomberg, the kind of presence they have. There are bureaus everywhere, whether it's Brazil or India or China, South Africa. On business news, I think Reuters just dominates the global news, the flow of information, the analysis. They affect the markets. They can affect the policies of the government. Reuters publishes something and governments start panicking sometimes. So I think because they have their tentacles everywhere. And I think this is what is missing. We don't have that kind of news agencies. We don't have that kind of TV channels. I think in that sense, you're right that the internet is a great hope because people are now watching more and more things on their mobile phones, are reading more information on internet, or some platforms like this are very important. And I think it's important for countries to pool in the resources and share information, share news. I think it's high time. I think there's only one Indian correspondent in China. It's India and China. Neighbors, our relations going back to thousands of years. The countries are so important for each other. We need to report more on each other. Same with Brazil, same with South Africa, same with Russia. Report more on each other and report more about each other and help each other in building that. I'm not saying that the stories have to be only positive or not critical. We should do critical stories. We should look at each other's problems as well. India is the world's biggest democracy, but it's not a perfect democracy. So many flaws there, which can be reported. But still, I think our objectives are different from the on the Western world. And I think a very good example of this is the climate change. The way Western media now reports climate crisis, it's a fault of India and China. India and China are now the biggest polluters in the world. But if you look at the per capita carbon footprint, it's much lower than America or Europe. But it's still, they have built this narrative. Who's to be blamed for the climate crisis are the emerging countries, and not US, which is actually absolutely wrong picture. So I think we need to understand our issues, and then we need to present them from our perspective. Yeah.
I think one of the other big issues for the media in developing countries like BRICS countries is marketing themselves. I know from experience, for instance, in the United States, you mentioned MSNBC earlier on. It's the branding that does it. If you actually look, not even critically, if you just look at the network, on an hour-by-hour basis, just look at it objectively, it's the biggest load of trash you've ever seen. What these guys do is that in the mornings they decide, hey, let's find the most emotional thing that we can rail up here for the rest of the day, for the next 24 hours, and we'll just book the relevant guests, one on this side, one on that side, or maybe just one from one side, and we'll attack this for the next 24 hours until we get to the next big story that comes along. So it's not informative in any way. It's not educating anybody in any way. It's not even entertaining in many instances. But the branding does it for them in a big way. And I think that's a big issue and a big challenge for media organizations in the developing world to brand themselves as big media organizations that you can go to if you want real news, if you want objective news, etc.
A very good example of the coverage that we get in the Western media is the last 3 FIFA World Cups. South Africa, Brazil, and Russia. You have the 3 BRICS countries hosting FIFA World Cup one after another. And when South Africa was hosting it, the kind of negative coverage South Africa got in the Western media was amazing. So everything wrong, the country is going to collapse, it will not be ready. And when it happened, the first African country ever to host the World Cup, it was really fantastic. Same thing repeated in Brazil. Before the World Cup in Brazil got such a negative coverage in the Western media, from Zika virus to anything. So it became the most dangerous country in the world. And the same story was repeated again in Russia. Because you have, it says that the Europeans are losing control of football. Football is going to Africa. Football is going to South America, to Russia. And I think, of course, India and China are going to make a bid for it in the future. So, for me, that was a very, very good example that how they can really distort picture. It was a moment of triumph or glory, you can say, for the country, but the picture is turned upside down. It's turned into a picture of shame. It's a very old intelligence tactics applied by the media to take away a moment of glory and turn it into something else. And because we don't have resources, I know people from India who came here for the World Cup, and they were really scared. They were scared about mosquitoes, they were scared about snakes. People coming from India are worried about snakes in Brazil, because that's what they were reading through what is being reported by the Western media agencies, that Brazil is a dangerous country. You can get killed on the street, you can get dragged by anaconda, you can get Zika virus, you can get this. And after they came here, and I was working in the media center in Rio at the time, they had a survey done by an independent agency, and most journalists said this was the best World Cup ever.
Right.
So reality and distortion. This is what we are facing. This is what need to be fixed.
I'd like to thank both of you for coming here today. Would you like to say any final statement, Amand, about this? It's been a pleasure having you here. Thanks for coming and visiting us at 247.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. My only hope is that what we talked about, changing the international flow of information to get voices heard, to get those voices of people who are not represented internationally, will change in the coming years.
All right, thanks a lot. And Shovan, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think because the BRICS as a group gets so much of negative press in general, I think it's important that we build our own narrative to tell our own story. It's important for us to engage with each other, and I think the positive thing has happened here, leading to the BRICS summit this week. There have been a number of meetings, ministers of forest, culture, economy, national security advisors, academics. Even there has been a BRICS Film Festival in Niterói. So I think BRICS countries are now looking beyond just the kind of a trade and business and financial arrangement. They're not just looking or building a counterbalance to IMF and World Bank, but creating a geopolitical group, as you mentioned. I remain very positive about it because it's such a disparate group, but it's still working. I think that's a positive thing about it, and I think media has to play a very important role in creating on that narrative. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Shobhan. Thanks again, Anand. It's been a pleasure having you guys here, and thank you for watching us here on TV 247.